It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a Thursday edition of the Locked On NFL podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Tyler Rowland, host of the Locked On Titans podcast. And typically, you would see my partner, Ryan Tracy, host of the Locked On Chiefs podcast. But folks, after only 1 week of being on the show, I have staged a hostile takeover. I have banished Ryan to the Shadow Realm so I can have you all to myself. All jokes aside, Ryan did have a few travel issues, so I am flying solo while his flight is delayed. But we have a lot to discuss, a lot of big storylines around the NFL from Wednesday to get into. We are going to talk about some issues in Chicago. We are also going to talk about the last episode of Hard Knocks with the Dallas Cowboys. And then, of course, we have to preview tonight's preseason matchup between the New England Patriots and the Philadelphia Eagles. So we're going to get into a ton, of course, starting with some problems in the Windy City with two rookies. So as we know, the Chicago Bears drafted quarterback Justin Fields in the first round, but in the second round, they took another player who was expected to fill a big role, and that was offensive tackle Teven Jenkins out of Oklahoma State. Well, unfortunately, Teven Jenkins has not been able to participate in football activities since the draft due to some injury concerns from college, and those have reared their ugly head as he had surgery on his back on Wednesday, and he is out indefinitely. Now, this is even bigger news when you consider that the Chicago Bears let go of longtime tackle Charles Leno, so now they're going to be in a difficult spot filling that left tackle role, and the Chicago Bears are in a position as a franchise right now where they have to win games. Matt Nagy, Ryan Pace as the brain trust there at head coach and GM respectively. They don't have a season to waste, and not having their high-priced second-round left tackle that was slated to start could spell problems for an offense that has its dry spells at times. Now, of course, they're expected to get a shot of life from rookie quarterback Justin Fields, but if he doesn't have a competent offensive line in front of him, well, then that could spell trouble as well. And Matt Nagy, head coach of the Bears, talked about the injury to Teven Jenkins, and he did say that they hope to get him back this season at some point in time. Not 100% certain of that, but Matt Nagy also said, because there were some injury concerns about Teven Jenkins during the draft, he was expected to be a first-round prospect, but then those concerns caused him to drop to the second round. And Nagy had this to say, quote, "We were aware of the back issues in college. These are new symptoms," end quote. So you never want to hear that. And one thing you can find out from anyone who has had a back injury in their life, they don't just go away. So definitely cause for concern there in Chicago, but that is not the end of the injury concerns for their high-priced rookies there in Chicago. Justin Fields is going to be missing some practice with a groin injury going forward, and according to head coach Matt Nagy, the Bears want to be, quote, extremely conservative with Justin Fields. Matt Nagy also had this to say, quote, "We want to be smart, and it doesn't make sense right now to push the limits with him and take a chance of making it sore." So it sounds like just an abundance of caution, and Justin Fields isn't expected to be the starter day one anyways, so there's no reason to push him to be ready for week one. The week one starter is set to be Andy Dalton, and Andy Dalton also had some interesting comments on Wednesday. Essentially, he said, quote, "Justin Fields is going to be a great player for a long time, but it's my time now. And that's a little bit of a paraphrase on what Dalton had to say, but that was the gist of the quote. And from Dalton's perspective, he was brought into Chicago and told that he was going to be the starter. The Bears brass has held firm that Andy Dalton will be the starter at the beginning of the year for the season, and they're hoping that he can be the starter for the entire season. So if you're Andy Dalton, as a competitor, you can't just lay down and die and give the job to the rookie, regardless of the hype around him or how excited the fans are to have Justin Fields or how good he looks during training camp. You have to chop wood and carry water, one of my favorite phrases if you're Andy Dalton, and that includes being confident in your abilities and being confident that you can be the starter for this team and lead them to the playoffs, even if most of us don't believe that is the case for Fields. Either way, a lot of big news coming out of Chicago on Wednesday. Not all of it the best news, but either way, the Bears will have to fight forward. But we are going to move forward in today's show as well, continue this Thursday edition of the Locked On NFL podcast and discuss the latest episode of HBO's Hard Knocks series covering the Dallas Cowboys training camp this season. Before we get into that, do want to tell you guys about rockauto.com. Rockauto.com is a family business that's been serving online customers for over 20 years. Rockauto.com's catalog is remarkably easy to use. It's easy to navigate. You could quickly see all the different brands, specifications, and prices that you prefer. And best of all, speaking of the prices are always reliably low when you shop at rockauto.com. So make sure you go to rockauto.com right now, see all the parts available for your car or truck, and when you make your purchase, make sure that you write Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need, rockauto.com. NFL fans, we are going to start this second segment the same way that this week's episode of Hard Knocks started, and that is with peace and serenity. Namaste, my Locked On NFL listeners. The Cowboys started out this week's episode of Hard Knocks doing a little bit of yoga out on the field, and of course with the status of athletes' mental health in the news constantly now. I think it's important for those guys during training camp when things are so competitive and these guys are so stressed out all the time, fighting for spots and trying to get better. It's important for them also to be relaxed and be peaceful and bring calmness to their psyche while they go through these very, very stressful times. But I thought that was a very interesting start to the episode. But in the episode, there was a lot of high intensity competition as well, as the Cowboys had joint practices with the Los Angeles Rams. And joint practices are some of the most competitive environments you're going to get in the NFL outside of Sunday's game. Some of the best Hard Knocks moments ever have come from joint practices. I mean, my favorite Hard Knocks moment ever is I Fear God by DeAndre Hopkins going at D'Angelo Hall when Hopkins was with the Texans and Hall was with the Washington football team under their former name. And then he broke off D'Angelo Hall's ankles. I mean, that was just an all-time Hard Knocks moment, and you got it because of the intensity and the competitiveness of joint practices. And we saw that intensity boil over during this episode as the Cowboys' offensive line, I do believe it was Connor McDermott, got in essentially a fight with defensive lineman for the Rams, Aaron Donald, in the middle of joint practices. A little bit of a skirmish. You love to see that. Not from your favorite team. You don't want to see those fights because you don't want guys getting hurt. But hey, Hard Knocks is meant for entertainment. And quite frankly, I was entertained. Aaron Donald is a monster, but the Cowboys' offensive line's looking like they're getting back to health, and they're going to need that offensive line to be a pillar for their team as it was when they had success in recent years. But speaking of the other side of the line, Demarcus Lawrence was a highlight of this episode, talking about his family, talking about his maturation as a man, and it was well documented during the episode. He's not a very patient guy, which is something that I can relate to very much. But Demarcus Lawrence was talking about how his family has really allowed him to be more patient. It's helped him in his football game. He's had to come back from some injuries as well. A back injury that he's been dealing with has had him limited throughout camp. And speaking of back, the Cowboys need him back. He certainly is their most talented edge rusher, and they don't have a lot on the defensive line. We saw Terrell Basham get highlighted, but he dealt with some injuries. And speaking of that Cowboys defensive line outside of Demarcus Lawrence, I came away very unimpressed. They put a highlight on that defensive line room when they talked about defensive line coach, I believe it was Andre Durde. They talked a lot about him because of his ties to the international NFL program, and we'll discuss that a little bit. But some of the antics I saw from the Cowboys defensive line group and some of the ways that they treated their coach, it makes me wonder about how hard those guys are working. Even the defensive line coach, Durde, had to scold them at one point during the episode for their conditioning and taking care of their bodies because they're cramping up during drills and not able to get the work in that they need to get in to get better. So I came away a little bit concerned about that Cowboys defensive line group, but ultimately talent wins in the NFL, and if they can get Demarcus Lawrence back in the fold, no pun intended there, they should be better off anyways. Also, speaking of that defensive line, they did shine that light on defensive line coach Andre Durde. He came from the international program, played in NFL Europe, came over, has been on coaching staffs for a few years now, getting his shot as a defensive line coach. And there was a big international flavor to the entire episode outside of Durde, and who doesn't love an English accent, which was obviously something that the players in the defensive line group were talking about quite a bit and mimicking. But they also shined a light on Azur Kamara, who was a guy who came over from Ivory Coast, a defensive lineman who was an undrafted free agent in 2019, on practice squad in 2020, fighting for a roster spot. I think it's unlikely that he gets that spot, but you love the story, and you never know. Guy keeps working, hasn't had as much experience with football as other guys because he came from a foreign country and just came over to America to try to start a life as a refugee from the Ivory Coast. So he's a little bit behind your normal football players have been playing football most of their young lives. So guys like that can blossom late. He showed some good ability to get around the corner. He's got some good athletic traits as well. Just needs to work on those fundamentals, work on technique, and he may be able to carve himself out a career. But we also saw a lot of international talk, two players out on the field who are fighting for roster spots, one for the Cardinals, one for the Cowboys, talking about how they, are just, I guess, overwhelmed or appreciating the fact that they're out on the NFL stage coming from international situations. Definitely not the most likely of stories to see success in that way. So you love to see the international flavor to the episode. But some guys who we know a little bit more who were shining out there. Micah Parsons, again, every single episode. And this is obviously on purpose, but every episode, Micah Parsons continues to shine every time. Also, CeeDee Lamb just looks like he's going to be a guy on fire. Jerry Jones talked about in the episode how he's really bulked up and improved his body and put on extra pounds and extra mass. I think that's only going to help him be more successful throughout the season. Speaking of fantasy, CeeDee Lamb's a guy you really need to target in fantasy football. It seems pretty self-explanatory at this moment in time. And then also they did put a highlight on Ben DiNucci, the third-string quarterback for the Cowboys. Had some ups and downs during the episode, but you like to see him come up on a high when he won a chess game against Micah Parsons. And quite frankly, that is probably the only game that Ben DiNucci will ever beat Micah Parsons at. So a good episode number 2 of Hard Knocks. Wanted to make sure we recap that for you guys, of course, on HBO. But we are going to move forward and preview tonight's Thursday night preseason game between the New England Patriots and the Philadelphia Eagles. Before we get into that, though, do want to remind you guys about betonline.ag, the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your sports action. Football season is about to kick off. Baseball season is in full swing, so there's a ton of things to go place some wagers on. Make sure that you head to betonline.ag. You can use your laptop or your mobile device. Just sign up for free and use the promo code Locked On. That's one word, Locked On. And when you do make that first deposit, you're going to get a 50% welcome bonus. They're literally giving you free money at betonline.ag when you use the code Locked On. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. We are going to cap off this Thursday edition of the Locked On NFL podcast, previewing the Philadelphia Eagles against the New England Patriots, kicking off week 2 of the preseason tonight. Good matchup here. New England is 1-0 after winning their first game of the preseason. Philadelphia 0-1 after losing to the Steelers in their first game. And there are a lot of interesting storylines headed into this matchup. And a lot of those, in my opinion, reside on the Philadelphia side. Number one, high-priced first-round rookie Devontae Smith returned to Eagles practice this week. Will we see him in this preseason game? Will he make his game debut for the Eagles? I would say probably not. I don't think you want to risk putting Smith out there this early when he just returned to practice. But either way, him coming back to practice is good news for the Eagles. Sticking with the wide receiver position, Jalen Reagor, first-round pick from 2020, had an excellent week of practice in joint practices against the New England Patriots. Had just an absolutely incredible one-handed catch in the end zone during those joint practices. So clearly, he is feeling pretty good. I would expect to see him out there in this preseason game. The Eagles need to make sure they're developing chemistry between Jalen Hurts and his new wide receiver core that he doesn't have a lot of experience with. So I would expect to see Jalen Hurts out there and Jalen Reagor, and it'll be exciting to watch them for the short amount of time they are out there. Still enjoyable to watch them build that chemistry together. And we got to watch the Eagles' offensive line. Andre Dillard, left tackle, is dealing with some injuries. Jordan Mailata, is he going to come in? How's he going to hold up? The Philadelphia Eagles fans seem to be higher on Mailata sometimes than they are Dillard. So we'll see how that shakes out on the New England Patriots side of things. There are a lot of good storylines there as well. And of course, everything starts with rookie quarterback Mac Jones. In preseason week 1, he was 13 for 19, 87 yards, led the Patriots down the field pretty well, gave you about everything that you would want to see from a rookie quarterback playing with the second string. And there are some whispers and some rumors coming out of New England that, you know, this competition is still open between Cam Newton and Mac Jones. And while Mac Jones would have to do a lot to take that spot away from Cam, nothing that Cam has done has absolutely certified and stamped that he's going to be the starter. He may be the runaway favorite at this moment in time, but you know, there is a way that Mac Jones could maybe climb his way back into week 1 consideration, and it would start with a strong performance against the Philadelphia Eagles. Also, do want to take a look at rookie running back for the New England Patriots, Ramondre Stevenson out of Oklahoma. He had 10 carries for 127 yards last week. 91 of those yards came on his longest touchdown run. That 91-yard run was explosive, and you know how Bill Belichick is in New England. He likes to keep a stable of running backs and rotate those guys in. Sony Michel hasn't really impressed in any way, and you got a guy like Damian Harris who, you know, is expected to get a lot of the work. But again, Belichick likes to keep a stable of guys. He likes to rotate his running backs in and out. And if Stevenson can be explosive in that way and give them a really solid home run threat, there's no reason that the rookie can't get some carries and get some reps when the season comes around. I also want to keep my eye on the New England Patriots wide receiver situation. Jacoby Myers has been the belle of the ball during training camp when it comes to Patriots wide receivers. But they still have high draft pick N'Keal Harry from 2019 who's fighting for reps and fighting for a spot. Requested a trade earlier in training camp. I thought that was pretty peculiar. Quite frankly, he doesn't have the status in the NFL or has shown anything to be able to have the clout to request a trade. But all of the noise right now is about Christian Wilkerson, the undrafted free agent from 2020. Last week, he had 6 catches for 39 yards, and the Patriots have had historic struggles, especially recently, with their wide receiver groups, at least the drafted guys, the young guys they're trying to bring on. So can they mine a couple diamonds in the rough to change the tide here of what's been happening to them recently? Maybe Christian Wilkerson is a guy who can get them towards that goal. But either way, excited to have football back in our lives. The weekend of football has kicked off again tonight. We're getting closer and closer to the regular season. But make sure you guys check out the Locked On NFL podcast by subscribing on whatever platform you do stream podcasts. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the Locked On NFL YouTube channel. Smash that notification bell so you know when all of our episodes go live. Make sure you check out tomorrow's show, the Friday episode of the Locked On NFL podcast, and I will be back with you guys. Ryan should be back if I bring him back from, the Astro field, the Astro realm, the dark ages. If I decide to bring him back to join us, then I guess he'll be back with us next Thursday. But that's going to do it for me today, folks. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we will see you tomorrow.